webinar, and so I'll be sending out a copy of the slides and the recording after we finish the webinar. And before we get started, I also wanted to encourage you, there's a chat to use the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. Feel free to post comments or questions there, or you can also just chime right in with your questions throughout. You can mute and unmute your phone line. You'll see that in the attendee box, and so you can click on that and feel free to just ask questions directly to us as we go through the webinar. I tend to like to keep these informal and hopefully have a great conversation with you. So today for our webinar, we're really going to provide a high-level overview of NAEYC's higher education accreditation system, and just do a brief overview of the process for accreditation and look at the evidence that we use within the accreditation system to evaluate professional preparation programs and their alignment to the professional prep standards. And I'm also really pleased to have with me a colleague who will be talking about the work that we do for the accreditation in Connecticut and in North Carolina. I'm really pleased that Jennifer Johnson, who is Director of the Quality Improvement Division in the Head Start Collaboration Office in the Connecticut Office of Early Childhood, is able to join us and share with us her experiences with accreditation, both in Connecticut, where she is now, as well as in North Carolina, where she has extensive experience. Jennifer also is a peer reviewer in our accreditation system, so she brings a lot of insight, both as an end user of the accreditation system and is also one of our really valuable volunteers who gets to go on site visits and see a wide variety of early childhood programs. I see that we have several others who have just joined us, and welcome to the webinar. I want to encourage you to use the chat box to post any questions or comments that you have, or feel free to unmute your phone lines and ask your questions directly throughout. So we'll just take questions as they come into us. So I thought before we dive into the accreditation system itself, talk a little bit about why accreditation, why it matters, and why NAEYC has invested so heavily in building an accreditation system for early childhood degree professional preparation programs. And so while our accreditation system is 12 years old, we have been around for a while, I wanted to talk about it in a context of power to the profession. Which is, as you probably know and hopefully have heard, is an effort that NAEYC is engaged with a multitude of other early childhood organizations to build out a defined profession, an early childhood educator profession. And this work is intended to create a framework, a consensus framework around what the career pathways are for the profession, agreement on the knowledge and competencies that we expect early childhood educators to have, what the qualifications should be for who becomes an early childhood educator, and to also build out a compensation structure that we really want to tie this not just to a sense of defining standards for the profession, but also defining a compensation structure that recognizes early childhood educators for the wealth of professional knowledge and practice that they bring with them to their early learning settings. And building out a framework that engages states, higher education, regulatory bodies in bringing to life this shared framework. And so throughout Power to the Profession, we've organized it in a series of decision cycles where we are examining our professional identity, examining competencies and setting the competencies for the profession, thinking about who prepares early childhood educators and what those pathways should look like, as well as accountability structures, which is where accreditation comes into play, and thinking about accountability structures for professional preparation programs and for the individual early childhood educator herself. So another way to look at this is in terms of this graphic. As we think about typical professions and features of professions, accreditation of professional preparation programs is one of those core features in every program, in every profession. And the influence that accreditation has on professional practice, on consensus around the standards is critical. And so as we think about NAEYC's higher education accreditation system, we see this system playing a very important role within the profession and serving as this function for accountability within the profession. And I think about accreditation and in terms of why it matters, thinking about it in terms of from a global perspective and the role of accreditation plays, as well as the role that it plays with the institution of higher ed itself and the program in that institution. So accreditation, at that global level for our profession, it serves as a quality recognition system for our profession, recognizing programs that meet national standards around professional preparation, and it serves as an accountability mechanism. And in terms of ensuring that programs meet those standards and holding them accountable if they don't meet the professional preparation standards. And as I said a moment ago, the accreditation, it's a really important feature of any self-governing profession. I think we know in educator preparation, whether it's in the early childhood arena or in the K-12 arena, if we as the profession are not willing to step in and hold ourselves accountable, there are many others who are willing to do that for us. And we see this as a really important way, our accreditation system, as the profession setting what the standards should be around professional preparation and holding ourselves accountable to those standards, as well as the accreditation serving as a way to build out stronger pathways for the early childhood workforce. We know in the early childhood education arena and in our higher education arena that our students in our post-secondary programs is primarily the non-traditional student, and that is the non-traditional is the traditional student in our higher ed pathways. And accreditation serves as a really important lever for supporting that's the student population and ensuring that we can maintain the diversity in our early childhood workforce and ensuring that our preparation pathways don't stand in the way of our efforts of maintaining a really diverse early childhood educator workforce. And accreditation, it serves as a way of building consistency in both quality and in the content of our early childhood degree programs. We're really proud of the fact within our accreditation system that our accredited programs look really different from each other. But what is consistent across all of those programs is that they are all meeting those professional preparation standards and ensuring that their candidates are adequately prepared in assessment, in understanding and utilizing a multitude of instructional practices, and understanding child development and being able to utilize that to build out positive and meaningful early learning settings or classrooms and building really positive relationships with young children. So we like to say a lot in our system that it is about meeting the standards, but it's not about standardization because we highly value the individual context of every accredited program and think that plays a really important role in how programs design their curriculum and their field experiences so that they're preparing early childhood educators to really meet their local contexts. So at the global level, accreditation matters, right? Because it serves as this accountability function and this quality recognition function. But it also really matters for reasons around program quality. And this is the reason why most programs will come through the accreditation system, because they use accreditation as a way to support their efforts to increase student success in their programs. As part of their accreditation, the self-study work, they are really examining that student experience from before they even get to their programs, to the experience while they're in the programs, and looking at what happens to their graduates after they leave their programs. So accreditation, our accreditation system really is aligned to ongoing efforts at institutions of higher education, and it is aligned to the priorities of institutions in terms of really improving that student success and improving student experience. Accreditation also supports the work that our programs are doing to build out relationships with early learning settings so that their candidates can have high quality field experiences throughout their programs, and so that the program better understands the local workforce needs and can make sure that their programs are designed to really meet those workforce needs. And programs have also found as they go through the accreditation experience that it helps them better measure their candidate readiness for practice, for wherever they end up after they leave the programs. It helps the program better understand their student performance in relation to the standards, and has supported their efforts around articulation and transfer. And candidates coming out of the programs value accreditation. They find that accreditation is an assurance to them that they are learning what they need to learn and having those experience to practice during their programs, so much so that they will be ready as any early childhood educator, first-time early childhood educator can be, for the classroom or for the early learning setting. So just a little bit about NAEYC accreditation. We are, as you all are probably very familiar with, our accreditation system for early learning programs. That is the accreditation system that I think NAEYC is most known for, and through that we accredit over 7,000 early learning programs serving young children. But NAEYC also offers and runs two quality assurance and accountability pathways for higher education degree programs. So I wanted to acknowledge, while the focus of our time today is really going to be on our higher education accreditation system, many of you probably know that NAEYC also serves as the early childhood SPA within the CAPE accreditation system, CAPE, the Council for the Accreditation of Educator Preparation. And in that system, we will recognize programs at the baccalaureate and graduate degree levels that are aligned to NAEYC's professional preparation standards. We find that most higher education programs utilize NAEYC's professional preparation standards as a framework, whether it's a framework for designing their curriculum or that the standards are infused throughout some of the courses in the program. Almost every higher education program uses the standards. Our work with CAPE as the early childhood SPA is with only licensure programs, early childhood licensure programs, and it's a much smaller review of the program than what we do in our accreditation system. We built the accreditation system 12 years ago, primarily coming out of the community colleges who wanted a way for their programs to be recognized, and through the volunteerism of faculty to serve as peer reviewers, and with our first associate degree programs volunteering to go through the system, we created this system that looks very much like other higher education accreditation systems. And our accreditation system, it is the highest level of review that we provide for higher education degree programs, and it's the most extensive review of programs. So on the CAPE side, when we are looking at early childhood degree programs, we are primarily only looking at the assessment system of that program, and it's an electronic review of that program. They just submit essentially their assessments, and then it's all reviewed. There's no site visit involved in that process, and there's not a commission making a final decision on that. Whereas in our accreditation system, we are looking at all dimensions of the program. So we look closely at the assessment system and the data coming out of that, but we're also looking at all of the learning opportunities in the program that allow candidates to learn about and practice the standards. We're looking at the quality of faculty and looking at who the candidates are. There's a site visit involved in the accreditation system, and then we have a commission that actually oversees our work and makes the final accreditation decisions. We are building out, last year we began accrediting early childhood degree programs at the baccalaureate and master's degree level, and we very intentionally expanded the system so that every early childhood degree program in the country had an opportunity to move through one of our quality assurance pathways. So our accreditation system is open to programs that lead to licensure, as well as programs that do not lead to licensure. And it's open through the master's degree level. We were also positioning ourselves as well, given the work of Power to the Profession, is that we knew our accreditation system needed to be open to the entire higher ed profession. So we expanded beyond the associate degree level for that. We were well positioned for this because NAEYC's professional preparation standards, those serve as our standards in our work with CAPE. They serve as our early childhood SPA standards, and they serve as our standards in the accreditation system. So we felt like we were well positioned to expand the system because our standards were already set up to serve across all degree programs. And so our accreditation system really focuses on programs that prepare the early childhood educator. And I pulled this graphic from Decision Cycle 1 of Power to the Profession, which was focused on defining who they were looking at the early childhood field and then thinking closely about who the early childhood profession is. And you'll see at the top of this circle in the orange that when we talk about the early childhood profession, we're really talking about the educators, early childhood educators, the faculty who prepare them, and the pedagogical and instructional administrators who support early childhood educators. And so our system is really focused on preparing the early childhood educator, the individuals who are responsible for planning and implementing developmentally appropriate learning experiences, the individuals who are responsible for establishing and maintaining a safe and caring environment for young children, who are responsible for assessing and documenting assessment. We recognize that individuals in early childhood degree programs may be preparing for a multitude of roles, either within the early childhood profession or within the field. But at the core, regardless of the area where they will be serving, that it's really important to have those core early childhood educator competencies and to be grounded in those before they enter into some of these other roles in the field. So just some fast facts about our accreditation system. We have 195 institutions that have accredited early childhood degree programs, and we have a little over 230 accredited programs. We're in 39 states, and we continue to grow, and we're really grateful to have a pool of over 200 peer reviewers who support the system by conducting the site visits. As I said, last year we accredited our first baccalaureate programs. We're thrilled that Mississippi College and University of Alabama, Birmingham, have programs, early childhood degree programs that are now accredited, and we have many other baccalaureate and master's degree programs that are in the accreditation pipeline, either awaiting accreditation decisions or they are in the self-study phase. So we're really thrilled about the expansion and that we have so many baccalaureate and master's degree programs that are coming through. Right now, we accredit about 20% of all associate degree programs, and we're really proud of that number because our accreditation system is voluntary. And so 20% of programs have stepped forward and moved through this accreditation process because of their desire to ensure that they are meaningfully implementing NAEYC's professional preparation standards. And again, I just want to remind folks that if you have questions, feel free to post them in the chat box or unmute yourself and just ask your questions over the phone line. So we're eager to hear from you. Just a little bit about the structure of our accrediting body. So NAEYC accreditation of early childhood higher ed programs, we operate within NAEYC, the larger organization, but we are autonomous within NAEYC. The NAEYC governing board has delegated authority for the accreditation system to our commission. And so our commission is the body that sets the accreditation standards. They make the accreditation decisions, and they set the policies and procedures for the system. So it is the Commission on Accreditation of Early Childhood Higher Ed Programs. It's a mouthful. I know we're working on a better acronym, but they are the ones who oversee and really set the standards and make the decisions for the system. And as I mentioned, we have a pool of over 200 peer reviewers, and Jennifer, who you'll be hearing from in just a little bit, is one of those peer reviewers who provide critical support to the accreditation system. They conduct the site visits. We send a team of 3 peer reviewers out to every program for site visits, and they are there to really learn about the context of the programs, to gather evidence, both from what they see in the self-study reports as well as their site visits. They gather the evidence around the program's alignment to the standards, and they report their findings to the commission. So they don't make a decision around accreditation, but they are the fact finders and gather the evidence and report that out to the commission. And then as staff here at NAEYC, we have a team of 4, and our role is to really manage the operations of the system and to implement the policies and the procedures that the commission sets for the accreditation system. Our commission and peer reviewers, these are all volunteers. They are faculty across all degree levels, from the associate degree level through the doctoral level, who serve in these volunteer leadership positions within the system. We could not operate without these volunteers. We are very grateful for their service, and I'll talk about later on how serving as a peer reviewer, it's a great way to get some insight into the system and better understand how we view alignment to the standards, and to sort of see the inner workings of programs. So the mission of our accreditation system is threefold. One, we set the standards. We set the standards for early childhood degree programs for professional preparation quality. Secondly, we recognize programs for meeting those standards. And finally, perhaps most importantly, is that this is in benefit to the profession, to the programs that go through this process, to the graduates of the programs, and to the young children and the families that our graduates serve. So we take this very seriously, and as programs move through this process, they hear us say throughout that if there's ever a step in the accreditation process that they are not seeing connected to how it benefits their programs or the young children that their programs serve, that to please be in touch with us and to connect with us on that, because all of this should be working towards supporting their efforts and their goals that they have set for their early childhood degree programs. It's a rigorous process to go through accreditation, but we also don't want it to be unduly burdensome. So we have worked really hard within the accreditation system to focus in on the evidence that we think is most likely to tell us about how those programs are implementing the professional preparation standards. And so we are continually looking for ways to streamline what we ask programs to submit in terms of their evidence, and streamlining the site visit process and the work of the commission to make sure that the rigor is upheld, but that we are also not causing unduly burdens on the programs or the volunteers that serve the accreditation system. So this is just an overview of the accreditation process itself, and we're not going to spend too much diving deeply into the process, but it should look very familiar to you in terms of a higher education accreditation system. So it mirrors the common steps that you'll find in other regional institutional accreditation experiences, as well as other programmatic accreditors. The process begins by submitting a short application for eligibility for accreditation, and I'll talk a little bit about the eligibility requirements. And then the bulk of the work really happens in that self-study phase. Once the program is accepted to begin the accreditation process, they spend a good amount of time in self-study, working on program design, working through that self-study report that, and preparing for that self-study report that they will submit. The period of self-study involves usually a lot of reflection, a lot of revision to program design as they prepare for the self-study report. There's a peer review visit that occurs after the self-study report is submitted. And then the peer reviewers will submit their report to the commission, and the commission will make an accreditation decision. Programs that are accredited, they remain accredited for 7 years, it's a 7-year period, and they'll submit annual reports and fees throughout that 7-year period, just to support their continuous improvement efforts, and so that we can also ensure that they are staying in compliance with our professional preparation standards. We find that a lot of programs, in terms of self-study, will often be in self-study anywhere from 2 to 3 to 4 years. And because there is so much work involved in revising their programs and really reflecting on all their assessments and learning opportunities, But we have seen, particularly of late in some of our efforts, when there's been funding available, we've had some funding from Kellogg, and when either states or institutional systems have provided funding and some additional technical assistance, that has helped reduce the self-study phase to 2 years or less for programs. But we often find that it's the fees in the accreditation system that are a big barrier for many programs moving through the process, and also having some of that additional technical assistance support, whether that's having faculty release time and some really more intensive technical support around what alignment to the standards looks like. That those have been really helpful to programs in reducing the amount of time that they stay in self-study. In terms of the eligibility requirements, we require that programs are regionally accredited. While we do in the accreditation system look at some of the infrastructure and resourcing in the program around its budget and how the institution has provided resources to the program in terms of personnel, access to libraries and technology, etc. We really rely on regional accreditation to do that deep examination within the institution around that element of program infrastructure. Now that we're accrediting at the baccalaureate and master's degree level, programs that lead to licensure in our cannot move through our accreditation process. They've been designated as low performing by the state. As you probably know, licensure teacher prep programs that lead to licensure report annually to their state, which reports to the feds on productivity and quality of their preparation programs. And in that process, states might designate some programs as low performing. So those that have that designation are not eligible to go through accreditation. We have set a threshold that programs have at least 18 credit hours, early childhood credit hours, in their programs. We find that that's the minimum level needed for programs to really provide meaningful opportunities for their candidates to learn and practice the standards. Programs have to have field experiences. They have to have graduated at least one class before they submit their application. And we also require faculty that have at least one faculty member in the program who has a graduate degree in early childhood education or a related field, have at least 18 credit hours in early childhood family studies. I'm not going to deep dive into the standards today. You are probably familiar with these. These are the standards we use for the accreditation system. Standards 1 through 6 are really learner outcome focused. This is about what students, early childhood educators, need to know and be able to do. And then standard 7 is a programmatic standard, looking at the quality of the field experiences offered in our programs. We know that clinical experiences are critical to program quality. So accreditation itself, it really is about connecting the dots. We look very closely at program context, who are the students that the program is serving, what is their community, is there a particular mission that the program has within the community. The standards are used as a framework, and then we look very closely at all the different learning opportunities that the program provides to the candidates, from the readings they require, the projects that the students do, guest speakers they bring in, their field experiences. We look across everything to look at the opportunities that the programs provide to learn the standards. And then we look at the assessment system and look at 5 to 6 of the major assessments used in the program to see how those are aligned to the standards. We look at the student performance data coming out of those, how programs are not only collecting that data, but really analyzing it and using it to make choices around how they improve teaching and learning in their programs. So accreditation, it really builds from the context, and then it builds on all of these different pieces. And this is just another way to look at what we examine. You'll see in that program context area all the different parts of the program that we're looking at, from the candidates to the faculty, looking at how the program is organized and resourced, the learning opportunities, and then at the heart of the accreditation system is really looking at those assessments and the data that's coming out of those assessments, as well as the field experiences. And then the commission will make an accreditation decision. And typically, these are the decisions that they might make around a program that's going through accreditation for the first time. That we use the evidence from the learning opportunities, the field experiences, the key assessments, the data, and how they use the data. All of that goes into how the commission evaluates the program and makes a decision about whether it's aligned to the standards. And programs could be accredited fully. They might be accredited with conditions. This is the most common decision, that we find the standards are met, but there might be some concerns, perhaps related to the quality of the key assessments, that need to be addressed. And so programs have 2 years to address that. And then there are times when the commission might reach a not accredited decision, that they found that the program hasn't met the standards. And we encourage, if programs receive that decision, most of the time they move right back into the self-study phase and prepare to go through accreditation again. So what I'd really like to do, I just again encourage you, if you have questions, to feel free to ask those in the chat box. And I'd like to now turn it over to my colleague, Jennifer Johnson, who is going to talk about how Connecticut and North Carolina have incorporated and supported NAEYC's higher education accreditation system in their states. So Jennifer, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Mary. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So in looking at these two states that I'm going to be presenting, they have a little different take on how they went about looking at the NAEYC standards and embedding them in their systems. In Connecticut, they have a law that anyone who is working in a state-funded pre-K must be designated as a qualified staff member, which can be accomplished in many ways. One way being a bachelor's degree, another way being an early childhood teacher's credential, which is what I'm going to spend most of my time talking about. And in doing so, the State Department of Education in 2010 created an articulation policy to increase the pipeline of graduates who were going to meet that legislation around the qualified staff member. That policy that came out in 2010 looked at community college early childhood coursework and how we could better articulate all of those courses into higher education institutions around the same set of standards. At that same time, NAEYC accreditation was really starting to take off. So when you think about in 2004, NAEYC was in pilot, and in 2006, some of the first programs were being accredited. So there was some work that had already been done. They also decided to help the higher ed institutions develop an early childhood teacher's credential, because in Connecticut, there are only 4 institutions that offered a degree, a bachelor's degree in early childhood, and it was embedded with a pre-K to grade 3 and special ed certificate, and they just were not graduating enough people. I think I'm going to echo now, Mary.
You're sounding okay. I think you're. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So those 4 institutions were just not going to be able to meet the demands of the pipeline. So they worked with the 12 public community colleges and 1 private, put them in cohorts, and helped them get through NAEYC accreditation. There was funding provided by a funders collaborative to get this work done. 4 community colleges went through at a time, and by 2014, all of those schools were accredited by NAEYC. Also, as a part of that, they developed, as I mentioned, the early childhood teacher's credential. This looks at the NAEYC process and all of those standards, and the higher eds, both community colleges and universities, agreed on those standards for their teacher preparation program. And the students demonstrate their competencies in those 7 standards in order to receive the early childhood teacher's credential. It is not a licensure pathway. It's like the alternative pathway, but allows them to meet the law of the qualified staff member. It also helps for articulation because the 4-year schools and the 2-year schools were teaching the same standards. So they now articulate completely from the 2-year into the 4-year program. through what's called a transfer articulation policy that was approved in 2017. It was the easiest one for the Board of Regents to take on and approve because the standards were completely aligned. It also opened up a lot of conversations between 2- and 4-year schools since they had the same standards, and they're able to talk about their key assessments and agree upon key assessments that are completed at the 2-year school that then the 4-year schools accept, so students are not having to repeat a lot in order to meet the degree requirement. So it's been very grassroots, very intentional in looking at the NAEYC standards and adopting those in order to make all of this work. North Carolina's story is a little bit different. North Carolina was part of the NAEYC pilot back in 2004. There were 5 states and 1 group of city colleges in Chicago that were part of the pilot and really kind of helped NAEYC identify the standards and kind of figure out what should be in that self-study process. I was part of the pilot when I was in North Carolina. There were 20 of the 58 community colleges that were part of the pilot, so really big. And we hoped that by getting NAEYC accredited, that articulation would be a seamless pathway in North Carolina. I'll talk more about how that's going as I go through. In 2006, the very first nationally accredited community college was in North Carolina. Not the one I was working at, I was number 5, but number 1 was in North Carolina. And it really was a learning process. It really took the community college faculty on a journey to understand more about what was going on in their own colleges. And when you look at those first criterion that Mary mentioned, A through E and the 12 criterion, to learn more about, you know, the mission of the school and how their early childhood program could support that mission, to how their faculty were supporting the mission and the vision of the college, and how everything was really tied together. In North Carolina, there is a course that's required to work in childcare called EDU 119, Introduction to Early Childhood. And the goal was that students would only be allowed to take that course from nationally accredited community colleges with NAEYC. That has still not come to fruition, but that's still an ultimate goal. In 2009, North Carolina won the Race to the Top grant, and they provided funding to help schools go through cohorts to actually get accreditation. It's still not quite there. I think 38 of the 58 community colleges are now accredited, but there's very few articulations that are statewide that are taking place, even though the standards are the same. Part of that is because in 2012, higher education teaching standards changed, and Mary touched on that a little bit. Students now have to submit portfolios to the Department of Education as proof that the teaching prep program is preparing the students to be teachers. And from the higher ed's perspective, accepting too many courses as transfer credit into their program might hurt their chances of having enough students complete their teacher prep portfolios so that they can maintain their current ability to continue to offer that certification. So as of today, there are 38 community colleges in North Carolina that are accredited. As I mentioned, there are a few statewide articulations. Some of the higher ed institutions will do articulation agreements with their local community colleges because in many times the faculty cross-teach across institutions, and so there's a lot more comfort level in accepting that coursework. So it's still a work in progress. That required course is still not required to be from a nationally accredited community college. But now that we're at 38 community colleges, the hope is that it won't be much longer. There is a lot of support for the programs to go through accreditation. There have been mentors assigned who are peer reviewers to help schools think about what should be in their self-study, help them with rubrics, talk to them about why they came up with those key assessments, prepare them for a visit, letting them know what should be in the room when the reviewers arrive, how a visit will go, questions they may be asked, so that programs don't feel quite so alone. Many of the programs in North Carolina are one woman or one man departments, where that one person is the one who does everything for the early childhood department. And oftentimes when you then add NAEYC accreditation on top of that, it's a little daunting. So those are our two stories. I went a little fast probably, but I'm happy to answer questions as to why both states have kind of gone this path.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. So, and just to remind everyone, you feel free to type questions into the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, or you feel free to unmute yourself and just ask your questions directly over the phone line as well. So, Jennifer, I'll give folks a few moments to ask, to maybe type in questions or ask questions, but I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more, maybe reflecting on the Connecticut and the North Carolina experiences on lessons learned around NAEYC's higher education accreditation system. Are there, what do you think really, what were sort of the conditions that really supported this work in Connecticut? And, accreditation has been, it's a meaningful part of the articulation transfer landscape there. And thinking about lessons learned in North Carolina, where it was such a large group going through. So perhaps some of the professional development lessons learned, but also, there's still work to be done around the hopes for how accreditation can support articulation in that state.
Yes, I'd be happy to. So both states have committees where higher ed and early childhood faculty meet together at least once a year. And I think that that is key, that those two groups open the conversation, because if they do it in isolation, then there'll be some hurt feelings and upset programs when they try to build articulation agreements and they haven't been at the table the entire time. As far as professional development, I think really going through as a cohort, they can be small, as Connecticut did it, 4 schools at a time. They can be a little bit larger. The state of Colorado had funding for the 12 colleges to go through at once. That was a little hard for NAEYC to schedule all the visits in one semester to one state, but that is another way to do it. And maybe looking at mentors, those who are either current peer reviewers, have been past peer reviewers, or programs that maybe don't have either reviewers, but have been through the process. There's a lot to be learned just by going through the process and sharing your experience. It's amazing when you sit down and think about the self-study process. You open the materials. There are 12 criterion that you have to write a 1 to 2 page narrative on, with strengths and challenges and how you plan to address those challenges. Then there are charts that you have to complete looking at your entire degree and how all of the coursework shows breadth and depth in all of the standards. And then you have key assessments with rubrics, and you've got to collect data. If you have someone who's gone through the process, whether they received conditions or not, they can really start to help you figure out it's not as daunting a task as it may seem when you're trying to do it alone. When you look at the 12 criterion, many of those things can be done with your institution's support. Criterion 1 looks at your mission of the college. Criterion 2 is the program's conceptual framework, which is really how the program embeds themselves into the college's mission. Criterion 3 starts to look at the course curriculum and why those courses are selected to be in that early childhood program, whether it's a state requirement or that faculty member feels that that is what's needed for the students to be successful in their part of the state. Criterion 4 starts to look at your teaching faculty. So when you start really breaking it down, I could keep going each criterion, but when you really start breaking it down, many of those things can be just thought of or accessed by looking at what's currently at your college. The bulk of the time needs to be spent on looking at what we call charts F and G. F is where you look at the breadth and the depth of the program and all the ways that your students can identify competency in the standards and all the key elements. So it could be anything from a discussion board to a report to a presentation to a journal. We try to stay away from tests, but sometimes a test may be the only way you can demonstrate that competency. And then looking at the key assessments. I know when I've mentored programs, I've told them, well, what are your 5 favorite assignments that your students do? And then let's see how many of the standards and key elements make sense to align to those, and then kind of do a gap analysis and see where do your students still have some areas that they're not addressing a competency in those standards in what you've submitted. And maybe you have to create a new assessment or fine-tune directions to get to that key element, and then you adjust your rubric, and now you've got the data. So it does help to have both that mentor and maybe a cohort partner who can kind of banter those topics back and forth.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you for that insight. And I think particularly given our audience today, we really focused outreach for this webinar with state agencies, both on the early childhood side and the higher education side. And I think some of the insights you provided are really helpful in thinking about how as state agencies we can support this work around accreditation. Both thinking about how it can support program quality and those preparation pathways, and thinking about how it's supporting the individual early childhood educator that is part of the workforce. So I really appreciate you sharing the Connecticut and North Carolina stories and the different ways that accreditation is playing out in both of those systems. And so I think in closing, I've been, it's a quiet group today. I've been monitoring, responding to some of the questions in the chat box. But I think just in closing, as as state agencies, thinking about how NAEYC accreditation can support your efforts, whether it's supporting some of the goals that you might have in building articulation and transfer in the early childhood degree pathways, as an example of what Jennifer laid out in Connecticut. Thinking about how this can support the state program approval, the teacher preparation program approval process, and how the standards are aligned to your state's program approval standards, and the role that accreditation could play in doing those program reviews. Maybe accreditation can be part of the state registry system, and thinking about how we acknowledge individuals who might graduate from accredited programs and have that count towards some of their recognition opportunities for advancement. There are a lot of different ways that accreditation can support the efforts and your priorities for the early childhood workforce in your state. So in closing, I wanted to just encourage you to think about how we can help support your efforts. We are really eager to talk with you and think about ways that we can partner to support accreditation in your states. We are deeply committed, NAEYC, to power to the profession and really building out those core components of the profession. And I think what's good is that we're not starting from scratch for the profession. We have so many of the components are in place, but perhaps have only been part of smaller parts of the profession. And so we're really committed to expanding our accreditation system so that it can support all early childhood degree programs. I've included on this slide, feel free to contact us at highered@naeyc.org to continue the conversation. We always have at our annual conference and Professional Learning Institute, we do a full day pre-conference accreditation workshop at every one of these. So If you or your colleagues are interested in getting more of a deep dive into the standards or the accreditation process itself, I encourage you to sign up for that. We'll be doing one at the June Professional Learning Institute in Austin. And as Jennifer said, becoming a peer reviewer, it's a really great way to see the internal workings of the accreditation system as well as insights into other early childhood degree programs. We are so fortunate in this profession to have such a diversity of degree programs. And so we want to make sure the accreditation system continues to support that. And as a peer reviewer, you get to see all sorts of structures in the early childhood degree programs and to see how the standards play out through those different structures. So I want to thank you for joining us today and being part of this webinar. Please don't hesitate to reach out if we can answer further questions, and I'll be sending out a recording of this webinar and the slides as well in just a little bit. So again, thank you for joining us and all the best for a good rest of your afternoon.